Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And welcome to a new year, our first proper episode of the new year. Happy New Year to everyone. And let's go to the new year of 1863, where January 1st brought a monumental political development, the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln declaring that all enslaved people in the rebellious southern states should henceforth be free. Of course, the implications of this are enormous. We've touched on all sorts of elements and wrinkles and fallout from the Emancipation Proclamation on this show. One specific element is that it also allowed black men to join the Union Army. That story is fairly well recounted. Of course, there's that movie Glory, which tells the story of one of the first black infantry units. And no surprise, it is a little more complicated of a story than that feel-good heroic tale that showed up in a movie like that. For one, black soldiers who escaped slavery and joined the army found the conditions within the army to be coercive, racist, and exploitative, and many of them ended up leaving the army to take care of family, escape abuse, and for other reasons. And that dynamic is the subject of a new book from Jonathan Lande, who is assistant professor of history at Purdue. The book is called Freedom Soldiers, The Emancipation of Black Soldiers in Civil War Camps, Courts, and Prisons. Professor Lande, Jonathan, welcome to the show. First guest of 2025. No one can take that away from you, but I appreciate you coming on.
Well, I'll take that to the bank then. I appreciate you guys having me on the show. It's great to be on the show and see it happening, listen to it happening, because I do enjoy listening to the show.
Well, thanks for that. And here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there. Welcome to our first proper episode of the new year. Happy New Year.
Hello and Happy New Year, Jody.
Hey there.
Jonathan, I want to go to the sort of Emancipation Proclamation and the fallout, and the ramifications, especially for black soldiers joining the Union Army. But actually, can you start with a little definitional thing that we will then certainly get to as we talk about the dynamic that you describe in your book? But I've seen even in the materials around your book the word deserter. Is that word deserter like super loaded and complicated when we talk about people who leave the army?
Well, I think so. I think the term desertion and deserter often has connotations with cowardice, with those who are unwilling or unpatriotic. And so especially with black soldiers during the U.S. Civil War, men who were not at first admitted to the army because there was a fear that they were cowards. The word has special connotations. So using the word desertion is, I don't think, necessarily problematic, but if you really want to cut to the history that I found and start to unpack what it means for black men, especially those who had been enslaved, to leave the army, then it does become increasingly more difficult to use that and untenable to employ the word deserter or desertion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll get to that, but then let's take a step back to the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the kind of hook we're using here at the start of the new year. What is the reason that part of the Emancipation Proclamation says, okay, now black men from the South can join the army? And what starts to happen in the first half of 1863?
So when the war breaks out, the war, of course, to establish a white republic in the South dedicated to slavery. They changed the Constitution in very subtle ways from the U.S. Constitution to make it all about maintaining slavery. And even Alexander Stephen, the vice president of the Confederacy, says the cornerstone of the new Confederacy is white supremacy. He says it is about the inferiority of black people, that Thomas Jefferson and the founders got it wrong. That it's about making a republic dedicated to the unalienable idea that slavery is the right place for people of African descent. So black men and black women in the South are resisting this idea, as they had for centuries, and many of them are bringing it out in the open. They see Abraham Lincoln's election as being the moment that they can now have this jubilee, this moment that has been long foreordained. And they resist, but the Union government, Lincoln himself, does not want to incorporate African Americans into the cause. There is heavy racism, which I mentioned, these fears that black men, if admitted to the army, will either, one, drop their guns as soon as they see their former enslavers, or two, and ironically enough, that they will be so vicious in battle due to the stories the myths around the Haitian Revolution, that it will be impossible to stop them from turning the war, a civilized conflict of nations, into a barbaric spectacle of bloodletting. So black soldiers are those seeking to be black soldiers, both North and South, are denied opportunities until increasingly Lincoln has to face the fact that the war is not going to be settled with just a few battles, perhaps. No battles he wished, but a few battles, perhaps. But failures by the Union military forces compels him to incorporate emancipation as a strategy. So he, in late 1862, starts to admit a few black regiments into the army and allow black soldiers to serve. And they do quite well, and they show that they aren't cowards, and they're also not vicious. So increasingly, Lincoln comes to the terms that he can use black men to help fight the war. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, something that he had threatened to do in September after the Battle of Antietam, and in January he follows through on that. And in a surprising move, he added the clause that said they were going to allow black men into the Union forces. And he chooses to do so because he thinks that they can help fight the war, and in particular occupy the South in posts, thereby letting white men go off and to face Robert E. Lee and the other Confederate generals.
Yeah, this is such a huge moment because, I mean, Frederick Douglass had been pushing Lincoln for a long time to, like, let black men fight, let black men fight. And that when they do, they really do help turn the tide of the war. You know, you have over 250,000 black soldiers that sign up, and their contributions matter deeply, especially when white casualties in the North had been high. People were worried about, you know, these high casualty rates creating a low morale and the belief that they might actually lose this war. When you get this influx of black soldiers, it does help to sort of shift the way that people see a possible Union victory.
And one of the things that I think we've seen in some of our previous episodes and discussions of wars with the United States is that black Americans sought to fight for the side that ensured them more freedom. And it's interesting to think about these black soldiers that you write about, Jonathan. I wonder if you have thoughts on their motivation. Do you see them as fighting for freedom, for the preservation of the United States, or both? Do they see those as the same project, or are they like, we're fighting for our freedom and to destroy this entity, but we're not necessarily as invested in just like the idea of preserving the Union, which has been the warehouse and storehouse of slavery for all of our years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think is not so well understood. It's a little bit murky in the literature, and I think the trouble is that you have people like Frederick Douglass calling for black men to enlist, and he, of course, was born enslaved in Maryland, but by the time the Civil War breaks out, he's in the North, and he's setting up a political program for the ways in which African Americans can push for broader political power. So in the North, there's a very specific drive to participate in saving the Union. Now, that is in addition to wanting to overthrow slavery and to affirm black manhood, which had been disparaged. But in the South, and this is really where I concentrate in my work, this current project, is that black soldiers from the South are enlisting primarily for freedom. And this gives them a distinct understanding of what the Army should be and what it should do for them. There's this great quotation that I found from a Wisconsin soldier who arrives in just near, I think he's in Mississippi or Louisiana, but he encounters black soldiers who had been raised in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And he discovers that many of these black men believe that they are the freest of all free men because they are soldiers, which is a profound irony given that most people understood the military in the 19th century to be the most disciplined form of labor aside from slavery. So these soldiers, black soldiers from the South, are enlisting, imagining themselves to be free, and this kind of drives the way that they fight, but also the way that they see enforcement of discipline, the way that they choose to interact when they're in the Army. So it's a quite dramatic view of motivations for those who've listened to Frederick Douglass say, men of color to arms, or those who had left a plantation and joined up.
That's so fascinating, the kind of different motivations and expectations from black soldiers from the South and black soldiers from the North. When it comes to expectations, I mean, a big part of the dynamic you describe in your book is the kind of mismatch of expectations and what the reality is within a regiment and fighting the war. What do people encounter? And I mean, there's so many great personal stories in your book. I don't know if there's a specific soldier you want to focus in on to sort of describe what that journey was like.
Yeah, so the soldiers, those entering the army, whether they're from the North or the South, and whether they're white or black, discover that the army is a grueling, grueling place. The discipline demanded of them is dramatic. One soldier describes, actually, a white soldier describes being treated like essentially a robot or an automaton inside the army, that every moment must be disciplined. And so black soldiers who enter, and especially those who had been enslaved, enter the army, they have these expectations that they are going to be the freest of all free men, as that Wisconsin soldier wrote. But what they ultimately discover is that they are being kicked and cuffed. And one soldier that comes to mind, actually, the soldier that I first encountered when looking for these stories in graduate school was a soldier named John Mitchell. And John Mitchell had been enslaved in Mississippi. And during the war, after the Union forces had made their way down the mighty river and secured a Union outpost, he traveled to Vicksburg. There he enlisted. And while he was in the army, he discovered that his captain was quite mean. And this is standard. This is par for the course. Things that John Billings, a veteran who wrote the famous Hardtack and Coffee History of the Civil War, described, is that officers demanded that you discipline everything, from the way that you smiled, from the way that you stood in line, all of it. So for a man who comes from that environment, where there is an overseer sitting just above you, waiting with a whip in hand to force you to bend down and pluck more pieces of cotton, and for him to enter the Union forces and then be kicked and cuffed, really drives him to the point that he requests to be transferred. He requests to be transferred to a different regiment. And this is quite common. His experience is actually less onerous than some of the other soldiers who had been hung by their thumbs, a technique where they would be strapped up and their toes would be touching the ground to put all the pressure there on their thumbs.
I mean, this was just kind of day-to-day discipline to kind of keep the regiment in line.
Yeah, and one of the more famous images is of black soldiers sitting on the wooden horse. And this was another constant form of discipline that was used on white and black soldiers alike. And the soldiers would be left up on essentially a 2x4, you can imagine, with their in the hot sun with their feet dangling and somebody there watching them. And so these forms of discipline were common. There were other more.
What is the point? Well, I'm shocked because I'm like, for a government that needs bodies to win a war, like the idea of torturing or these harsh, frivolous punishments, it almost seems like they are wasting their labor and their soldiers and their ability to be able to actually like fight and contend and win a war when you're engaged in these like hazing sort of practices. Like, I don't know how that boosts morale. It doesn't. I don't know how that gets people to want, to want to fight. Like, I don't see the purpose or the utility in how you employ that to win a war.
And that was just the theory that they had about how the army worked. And one of the things I delve into in the book is the differences ultimately between white soldiers and black soldiers and how they viewed this. Because white soldiers, many of them, not all of them, but many of them come to see discipline of this sort to be a useful means of keeping everybody in line. So they will use even the most extreme forms of discipline, which would be a ritual execution by firing a squad. Some of the white soldiers think that the hard hand of discipline is necessary. Black soldiers, however, never articulate this. And perhaps there was some soldier that at some point who served in the black regiments of the Civil War, known as the USCT or United States Colored Troops, thought perhaps that this was necessary. But I have not found one written account of a black man, either from the North or South, saying that this is a good policy. In fact, there's a Philadelphia cabinet maker an African American who serves in the famous 54th Massachusetts, who travels down and he sees the effects of the military on black men and compares it to the inexorable violence of slavery. So he kind of comes, he's early on, he's very patriotic and supportive of a Union war effort. But by the end of his military service, he had seen the execution of a black mutineer, and he thought that this was just not the best way to discipline. So it was the theory of the time, but black men never came to see it as being an acceptable means of punishment.
Folks, I have very good news to deliver right at the top of the new year. That's right, it is 2025 and the great Alex Goldman is back with a new podcast called Hyperfixed right here on Radiotopia. Isn't it nice to get good news to start a new year? You know Alex, right? You know Alex. I've actually known Alex for a long time, going all the way back to when we were at WNYC together. He worked on the Media, I worked in the newsroom. He went on to make the legendary and much beloved podcast Reply All, and now all is right with the universe because Alex is back with a new show on Radiotopia. Some things just make sense. So, what is Hyperfixed? Well, it's a show in which Alex and his team try to solve problems for their listeners. No problem too big, no problem too small. What's that mysterious button do? Why do the big coolers at grocery stores not have doors on them? Should I have kids or not? Along the way to answering these questions, Alex takes you on a journey to uncover the hidden systems and rabbit holes that help explain how we got here. And if you know Alex's work, you can rest assured that there is some vintage Goldman grumpiness along the way. Seriously, when we say that Radiotopia is the home for the most original audio makers in the world to try their ambitious new projects, this is what we are talking about. So, help welcome Alex Goldman to Radiotopia. Rejoice in an excellent new show to add to your rotation. It's called Hyperfixed. Hyperfixed. Check it out right now, wherever you get your podcasts. Look, I know it's a bit of a cliche to make a New Year's resolution to save more money. Probably even more of a cliche that resolution rarely gets kept. Honestly, I don't know when you're listening to this, but chances are I have already broken like 4 of my New Year's resolutions. But the saving more money one, it has been a lot easier for me thanks to Mint Mobile. I switched over to Mint Mobile's premium wireless service a couple months ago, and it has put some real wind in my sails going into 2025. Because their plans start at just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. Switching over from one of the big 3 carriers was incredibly easy, and boom, just like that, saving. I'm on my way. You can be on your way to fulfilling that resolution to spend less. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/thisday. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
It's so interesting because that experience of enslavement, or knowing that Black people have been enslaved and treated a particular way, shapes Black people's understanding of the military. And I think that that's also so important for the question of desertion, because we talk and write about maroon communities and fugitive slaves and flight as a form of self-emancipation, that this is the way that you become free. And then you enter into this military unit in which that freedom of movement is constrained and, in fact, seen as disloyalty and is seen as a crime. In the same way that, like, enslavers would hire people to chase down fugitive slaves and make an example of them. I would imagine for a lot of Black soldiers, especially Black soldiers from the South who were formerly enslaved, the way that the Army conceived of deserters and treated deserters would have felt quite uncomfortably familiar.
And to make matters even more constrained for these soldiers, is the soldiers that were best suited for the Union Army were often, from those from the South, were those who had left slavery. So they were the ones who wanted to leave the constrictions on their mobility even more than anybody else. And now they're entering a military that is constraining them entirely. So that's exactly to your point.
A lot of your book focuses on the kind of punishment for people who left, but do you want to talk briefly about some of the other motivations for leaving? Because it was, it's very humanizing, and people left the army for some of the reasons we were just describing, like recognizing the coercion and the power dynamics, but some of it was just like to spend time with family, to take care of personal matters.
Yes, so I'll start with John Mitchell because he ultimately does desert. He requests to be moved to a different company. They don't give him that permission, and so he leaves. He ends up working on a steamboat on the Mississippi River, where he's captured by a provost marshal. And so essentially he leaves because he's being kicked and cuffed. And that's one of the major reasons that I identified. The other two major reasons that I found in these sources, which is really the only spot to find why these soldiers deserted, unless it's from white officers' diaries or notebooks, is to go see their families. And many of them are learning from letters from their families or other soldiers that are entering the regiments who had just left the same plantations or the same cities and towns. They're learning that their wives and that their children are being abused by their former enslavers. Because these men, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, have become free as soon as they put their mark on that enlistment form. But many of their wives and children remain in slavery. So they hear of these things and they ultimately return. One soldier I found, he had frosted feet, and that's how he describes. So I'm not sure exactly what that was. He might have just had cold feet, or perhaps he got frostbite. But he returns home, and upon returning home, his former enslaver, threatens to. It seems to be that he threatened to do harm to this soldier's wife and children. So the formerly enslaved soldier ends up remaining on the plantation and helping to cultivate the next crop. So he has just entered the Union Army where he became a free man. And now he returns home and helps harvest the crop. So these soldiers' experiences during the war, it's a moving back and forth from freedom to slavery, showing that the process of emancipation is not fluid.
Yeah. This book is so timely and so good because it sort of distorts the clean narrative that we have about war and soldiers. And even Glory, the film, makes this sort of romantic idea of Black men that are, courageous. And that's not to say that they're not, but that these are complicated decisions that people are having to make in the face of really oppressive systems. And those oppressive systems are not just limited to the institution of slavery. It's also thinking about how the military dishes out its own form of oppression, how they're having to navigate this world without any real protection. I mean, there's no constitutional amendments yet. There's no sort of safe space that you can really be in until the war is over. And even that's complicated.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress that these soldiers were valiant and that you could have, just as in the film Glory, soldiers like the character Denzel Washington plays, who wanted boots. He just wanted shoes. That's why he ends up deserting. He ends up going out for a pair of fresh boots. And he's brought back and he's whipped, a practice that wasn't too common in the Union Army, but it was used from time to time. And that just kind of shows that these soldiers leave for very personal reasons. But then Denzel Washington ends up being one of the heroes of the film. And many of these soldiers had participated in battle to only then discover that their wives were being prosecuted by their former enslavers, or to come down with pneumonia and need to return home for special care. So you have these soldiers who are both great warriors, valiant, in the most true 19th century versions of manhood and valor. And then you also have them being quite human, where they need to return home for very personal reasons.
All right. Well, we will leave it there with Jonathan Lande, assistant professor of history at Purdue. The book is Freedom Soldiers, The Emancipation of Black Soldiers in Civil War Camps, Courts, and Prisons. It is out now. congratulations. I hope you're getting a little rest after writing this book. A little bit. But you did sneak in a reference to a future book, so I can see your brain.
The wheels are turning already.
No rest for the weary.
I also have 2 babies, so
you're in it.
There's really no rest.
Well, I was about to say I hope you have a restful 2025, but we'll see.
We'll see.
But thank you for being our first guest of 2025. You set a high mark, so
thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's been great chatting with you guys.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.